Before we begin with today's video, I'd like to start by saying that I am back from my excursion, and with quite a number of games that I need to catch up on, the grind shall now resume. And what a better way to start things off with Sonic's newest entry. Now, I do plan on spoiling the mess out of this game, so if you don't want any of that to happen, I suggest you go experience the game for yourself, then come back once you've had your fill. Otherwise, stick around, I'm happy to have you. Also, this is the Switch version of the game, as I decided to roll with that for its portability, so all the footage you're going to be seeing is from that version of the game. Anyway, if you decided to stay after that spoiler warning, let's begin. The story unfolds on an uncharted place called the North Star Islands, which is home to a lot of larger animals and filled with untapped technology. Eggman invades the place with the intent to use the tech for himself, turn the larger animals into badniks, and steal the Chaos Emerald so he can conquer the world. Basically, the Doc is up to his old habits, except now he's under the notion that bigger is better. However, he is not alone. He hires Fang the Hunter, or Sniper, also known as Knack the Weasel, to help him out, and the both of them enlisted a native to these islands to act as a guide. This clumsy native in armor goes by the name of Trip the Sungazer, and I'm going to talk a little more about her later on. As you would expect, Sonic and company was not going to have any of that, as they arrived at North Star Islands with a quickness and fully intend on crashing Eggman's party before he can inflict further harm. Now, it goes without saying that Sonic Superstars is a return to the classic formula, but with a brand new facelift, opting for a 2.5D look instead of rolling with 2D sprites like what they've done with Mania. If you've been on this channel long enough, you would know that I am a huge sucker for games with beautiful sprite work. However, I'm not against this art direction as long as the presentation is good. Some of the levels you'll be traversing through the game are gorgeous to look at, meanwhile the characters themselves are well animated, from their idle animations to their overall movement. I really love how the characters are even given a battle stance when they're in the middle of a boss fight, which is a nice touch I can appreciate. My only complaint with this new look, and this could just be a thing that exists in the Switch port, is that certain backgrounds have a blurry, unpolished appearance that seems like they haven't been rendered all the way through, and it looks like it came straight out of an N64 title. I have only noticed this on some of the stages, but it still looks jarring once it's caught my attention. Like I said, it could be just a thing that happens on the Switch, but if it's in every version, I say now's a good idea to polish those backgrounds should they decide to use this visual art style again. Other than that, I don't mind seeing them go this route in a future title. But how are the controls and overall feel for Sonic Superstars? So far, when Sega goes for the 2.5D style, the physics are usually different from the Genesis games themselves. It was like that for Sonic 4 Episodes 1 and 2, Generations, and the horribly implemented Forces. But to my surprise, Superstars actually does a very good job at capturing those classic physics. Everything you can do in the Genesis games can be replicated here in Superstars without feeling awkward, like gaining momentum off of half pipes in order to reach newer heights, or spin dashing off of slopes to launch yourself higher and further if needed. All of the characters have weight to them, which further adds to the sense of momentum the Genesis titles always had, and as you can expect with momentum-based gameplay, speed is earned. After playing a number of Sonic's recent titles up till now, it is refreshing to finally say that Sega nailed it with their control scheme. While I am on the topic of controls, let's talk about the characters themselves. The usual trio being Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles will handle the same as they always have, with Tails being the easiest character in the game due to his flight ability, and Knuckles retaining his kit that is fit for an explorer since he's able to glide and climb walls. Sonic meanwhile retains his drop spin, however his insta shield and his super peel out remains absent from his moveset, which in all honesty is a missed opportunity to bring those moves back. Amy is joining the trio this time, which I have to give Sega its props for making use of other characters that's been sitting on the bench as of late. I'm hoping we get to see other characters make their appearances too, but I'm a patient man and I don't mind waiting if it means they're slowly rolling them out. Returning to Amy's kit, the best way to describe her is that she's a more agile yet slightly slower Sonic. She can double jump, which is great for correcting mistakes or reaching higher areas in general, plus she uses her hammer during these actions, effectively extending her hitbox. She also has a drop spin like Sonic, but her version has her running forward while swinging her hammer. It's slower than Sonic by comparison, but it also adds a layer of protection, so it's best for dealing with any badniks in her way. This makes Amy an easier character to use when compared to the Blue Blur, but she also requires a little bit of finesse, which makes her fun to play as. It is worth noting that she is capable of cheesing a good chunk of the bosses in the game due to her agile gameplay. Finally, you have Trip, who becomes a playable character once you've beaten the main story. She has a double jump like Amy, but she can also cling the walls and ceilings while she's in ball form, placing her playstyle into the explorer category like Knuckles. While she has her own campaign, she can also be used on the main stages with everyone else. As her name suggests, Trip is really clumsy, as you'll often see her messing things up for Fang during their cutscenes, but she also has a heart of gold and resonates better with the heroes once she joins them. I overall felt that Trip is a nice addition to the team, and here's hoping that she will return in future adventures. Now, while the characters are great and the controls are fantastic, the level designs themselves are more of a mixed bag. Some levels are an absolute thrill to play, and they are definitely deserving of a revisit, while others felt undercooked or outright forgettable due to lacking any sort of uniqueness despite all of these stages being original. These stages contain multiple pathways a player can utilize, the lower end being slower and having more hazards to deal with, while the upper area is faster but more difficult in terms of its platforming. So if you want to blast through these zones, the game upholds the tradition of rewarding the player for having a great deal of stage knowledge to get the job done. So at the very least, they have the core foundation on what fits the criteria of a Sonic level. But despite having that understanding, not all of these stages are made equal. Bridge Island is an excellent can opener that not only looks very appealing, but it also does a fantastic job at introducing players to a majority of what they can expect in each zone. Speed Jungle is essentially Speed Highway, but now it takes a more lush appearance while the stage itself lives up to its name. Act 2 segues into a night theme where the player then needs to use these fireflies in order to navigate the darkness. I thought that was pretty neat. Air Ruins is one of those stages that falls under the realm of undercooked. While I like the concept it was going for and I appreciate the lack of pitfalls, the level looks boring from a visual standpoint and its design really doesn't have much going for it. In fact, it feels kinda empty and perhaps a bit too large. This might be due to the fact that there's only one act here instead of two, and perhaps splitting this one up would have been far better. Though I do appreciate that nod to SA1's Windy Valley at the end of the level with the whole tornado action going on. Pinball Carnival is your obligatory casino level, but this time they went for a horror theme instead of its usual festive approach, which brings me back to that haunted amusement park in Sonic Rivals. The second act leans heavily into that amusement park theme now that I think about it. Lagoon City is a straight up water park that has you zipping around a number of crazy water slides, and it often reminds me of the Hydrocity zone from Sonic 3K. Sand Sanctuary is another zone that only has one act, and it's accompanied by a lot of large snakes that will keep you on the move. Like Lagoon City, this stage also borrows some assets from Sonic 3K, this time reminding me of Sandopolis. I wasn't really interested in this zone to be honest, but the music is nice. Press Factory gives off an Oil Ocean vibe when it comes to the overall stage flow, and its first act has a bit of wacky workbench thrown in, as the machine in the background will occasionally cause your character to bounce if you're grounded when it slams down. Meanwhile, Act 2 has this threatening robo in the background that will instantly kill you if you don't reset the timer by hitting these switches you'll come across. I died quite a lot during this act, which made me very thankful that this game does not have a life system. I only wish this level was more visually appealing, as we've seen factory levels that look far more interesting than this, like Oil Ocean. Golden Capital is another pinball stage that will shower you with more rings than you can count, and it segues into Fang's base of operations during its second act. Admittedly, this was another zone I found to be a tad underwhelming compared to the others, and I just wanted to get it done and over with. Cyber Station is also part of the One Act Club, and it feels like you're running around inside of an arcade machine with Eggman calling all of the shots here. Frozen Base is quite forgettable. You'll see bits and pieces of ice cap sprinkled in with some machinery, and it reminds me of the robot graveyard from Freedom Planet 2, but aside from that, it's nothing special. Although the little shoot 'em up segment they had at the end of Act 2 was interesting. Then we finally have the Egg Fortress, where the stage is trying to put you in the dirt around every corner. The second act comes with an interesting gimmick where Eggman reverses time, and you'll have to travel to the very beginning with everything going backwards. This was a really cool idea, and it was definitely a creative way to cap off the last stage in the game. In every zone, the player can find the usual power-ups like your shield, the magnet which attracts rings but provides no protection, invincibility, and the speed-up shoes. You'd think the elemental shields would return, but there's a reason why they're omitted from the game. In addition to these power-ups, sometimes the player can stumble upon these portals that randomly open up, and if you enter them, it pulls you into this auto-scrolling segment where you're able to collect more rings. I found these to be an unnecessary add-on, as there was hardly ever a time where I was starving for rings, and it has the potential to ruin your pace, especially especially if you didn't mean to enter these at all. Usually they are placed out of the way, so if you want to avoid them, you can. However, they are much harder to avoid when you have more bodies on the board, because if one person touches these, your entire squad will get dragged into the mix. You can also find these medals, which serves as currency to buy cosmetics for your battle bot, and these medals can also be earned by finding a golden badnik or collecting 100 rings. Finally, we have the large rings, which will take you to the special stages. Gold ones will be your main go-to for emerald hunting, while the blue ones will let you gain a medal as your reward. If you fail to acquire the emeralds, you can try again by resetting the level and making your way to that golden ring once more. But once you've successfully acquired an emerald in a zone, any remaining golden rings will turn into blue ones when you revisit them. The game will let you know which zone you've already collected an emerald from by paying attention to the emeralds that are highlighted at the bottom left corner of your screen. If none of them are highlighted while you're standing in a zone's hub world, you haven't gotten one from that location yet, meaning you're free to go ahead and make that attempt if you want. The special stages this time around will have you perform some spider dude action by slinging from one node to the next until you're close enough to zero in on the emerald itself. The rings are your timer, which can be extended by collecting more of them, either by attaching yourself to the yellow nodes, which yields 3 rings apiece, or hitting certain launchers that will toss you into a good chunk of them, usually netting you around 10 rings each time. You can also latch on to bombs, which will slow you down if you collide into them. However, you can use them to your advantage and pull yourself closer to the emerald, then release your hold just before you come into contact. Doing this action can often put yourself in a better position, and it's really satisfying when you do this several times in a row without getting blown up. Additionally, if you are playing with multiple players, the character will switch each time you sling off the nodes, so teamwork and coordination is a must. The stages themselves are easy to do, but the targeting system can be very finicky at times, often locking onto something else you clearly did not mean to do and possibly putting you at a disadvantage. Or it might not just show up at all. I myself did not have too much trouble completing these, but it did get annoying from time to time when these targeting issues arise. Also, a quick side note, you can fall out of bounds if you don't latch onto anything. This only happened to me once, but this was mostly due to the targeting issues these stages have. Again, this was a design choice made for the sake of multiplayer, but honestly, I feel it would have been better to just run down a full pipe and trying to chase down the emerald like how it's done in Sonic Heroes. But hey, at least the special stage music slaps. Now, once you've gathered a Chaos Emerald, Superstars ups the ante by providing the player with a new power-up, which is something that was never done before, and I have to once again give Sega props for having a layer of innovation here. Each of these powers can be activated at any time, so as long as the powers haven't been used up, and they recharge every time you run past a star post, also known as checkpoints. By the way, you don't need to find a new star post to recharge them. You can keep using the same one as many times as needed. These power-ups are also the reason why the elemental shields didn't return. Avatar is the first one you'll unlock, and it spawns multiple clones of yourself to run over any enemy you've seen on screen, and it can even be used to cheese the bosses in the game, and trust me on this, you definitely want to do that. Bullet gives the character multiple air dashes in any direction until the power runs out, basically making any character in the game as mobile as ever. Easily the most useful power up in the game. Vision will cause hidden objects to appear, and the game will let you know when it's applicable. Water makes you extremely mobile underwater, and it can be used to travel up waterfalls. Ivies can cause vines to grow, which is influenced by the player's direction, and these are basically used to reach higher places. Slow does exactly what it says on the tin, and it causes time to slow down, which really comes in handy in some situations. Lastly, we have Extra, which allows all of the characters to gain a new attack until the timer runs out. Sonic gets his homing attack, while the rest of the cast will get a special projectile. Once you've gathered all 7 of the Chaos Emeralds, everyone will gain the final power-up, which is called Superpowers. It basically lets everyone activate a super form once they've collected 50 rings. Sonic will get his super form respectfully, while Tails, Knuckles, and Amy will be treated to a golden aura. All 4 of them will gain increased jump height and speed along with invincibility, while their ring counter will deplete over time. Trip, meanwhile, is the only one who gains a different form entirely, as she turns into a dragon, which enables her to fly around and breathe fire. fire, which is a nice surprise since the last time we've seen anything done differently with the super forms as far as the classic series goes is all the way back in Sonic 3K when they first introduced the Super Emeralds. Though I'm a little bit indifferent because as cool as this sounds, why does everyone get the same exact abilities, meanwhile Trip gets the special treatment? Tails should be strong enough by now to be able to have his flickies of doom by his side, meanwhile Super Knuckles does exist. I don't get why he has a golden aura instead of his usual pink tint he gets from the other games. Sonic should also be strong enough to perform an additional air dash on his own. Then there's Amy. They could have just allowed her to lob her hammers all day every day. This may come off as a bit nitpicky, but the super forms for the legacy characters just feels lazy. I'm just saying if you're gonna give one character a new form with different powers entirely, go the extra mile and do it for the others too. There is one other special stage you may enter if you happen to run past a star post with 50 rings. This one will take you to the special stages you'd see out of Sonic 1, which are toned down in terms of difficulty, and the rewards for clearing them are more medals for you to spend. When you clear each act, you'll be given the option to go to the next stage or return to the hub world. It's here you'll be able to revisit earlier zones or even switch your character before heading over to the next one. So just to keep things fresh and also get a feel for how everyone handles in the game, I've switched characters every time I entered a new zone, and I love the fact that I could. Sometimes you'll be given an option to play an extra act that is exclusive to each character in the game, like Speed Jungle where you have to outrun Fang as Sonic, or in Lagoon City when you're playing through a wholesome level as Amy while she's helping Trip. The whole purpose of these acts is to give you more context to the overall plot of the game. These additional acts do not interrupt the flow of these zones at all, and once you've cleared them, the game will then switch back to the previous character you were playing as. So you don't have to worry about getting locked into a character you don't feel like using at the time. At the end of each act, minus the first act for Bridge Island, you will have to face off against a boss. The first act will generally have you fighting against the larger badniks I've mentioned earlier, while Act 2 will have you square up against Eggman. I'm not going to mince words here, the bosses is where the game takes a nosedive to oblivion, as these fights alone was enough to piss me off to no end. Before I get into why these bosses are an absolute dumpster fire, we need to take a look at what made them good in the first place. The fun factor that came with classic style bosses is that they're quite synonymous with the core foundation of Sonic itself. If you want to defeat them faster, you need to get good. In the previous classic entries, including Mania, the bosses will typically have multiple attack phases, and it's generally up to the player to figure out when it's their turn to make their move and strike Eggman, creating a back and forth dynamic between the boss and the player. The thing is, it is the player who controls that dynamic as soon as the battle begins, not the boss. So if you know what you're doing, you can land multiple hits at a time and end these fights a lot sooner. That is what makes these battles fun. When you take that control from the players in these fights, all you are left with is a wall of frustration and complete annoyance that is bound to make you rage the longer these fights go on, especially if you end up losing your life to something that is completely out of your control, which has happened plenty of times. Hello? What killed me right there? Got him! In Superstars, it is the boss that controls the pacing of the battle, not you. Each of these bosses requires the player to do a lot of sitting and waiting until the boss decides to stop screwing around, do his attack phase, then you can finally hit him. And when it's your turn to strike, you're only allowed to hit him once before you're forced to sit through another one of the boss's down periods and taking its dear sweet time before it finally attacks you again. By the way, the flashing phase after the boss takes damage is a complete lie. It is invincible way longer than what is being presented, and that screwed me up quite a bit. Depending on which character you're playing as, these fights can take forever to clear, or they can end sooner if you're able to cheese them. But even that can have its limits, since there are some cases where the bosses are untouchable until they make themselves vulnerable. To make matters worse, these bosses do not have a clear hitbox either, as there were times where I would go in for the attack only for me to take damage instead. Furthermore, if you miss your chance to hit them, you'll have to sit around and wait for your turn all over again. This is exactly why I said you'll want to make use of that avatar power up to cheese these fights. This is made even worse when the bosses themselves have multiple phases, which is a good chunk of them in this game. If you were to die at any point during this stage in the battle, which by the way, this is really easy to do, you're going to have to start the entire fight all over again. This is more egregious during the auto-scrolling battles, the worst being Fang, arguably the giant BattleBot, and the Egg Titan. The first two I mentioned are terrible because these fights take way too long for what they are, and they have terrible hitboxes to work with. Meanwhile, the Mecha Death Egg Titan Deluxe, yes, that is the name of this monstrosity, takes both of these two fights and cranks them up to 1,000 by having the longest attack phases, followed by having the most finicky hitboxes to deal with. This battle alone almost drove me to the point where I had to put the game down for good, mainly due to the fact that this fight is insanely difficult for all of the wrong reasons. Long drawn out invincible phases where you can't do a thing to him is very common during this fight. Plus, your window of being able to damage the thing is pretty slim and very easy to miss. Furthermore, this boss can cheat you out of a couple of deaths when you least expect it to happen. This fight brought me to a level of frustration I didn't even know I could reach. And let me tell you right now, the amount of times a Sonic game managed to piss me off to that degree can still be counted on one hand. There is no doubt in my mind that these bosses were designed like this because of the multiplayer aspect, since having 4 players on screen will most definitely tear through these bosses like they're paper. However, I can't give them that pass for 2 reasons. One, they pulled this stunt before with the bosses from Sonic 4 Episode 2. Why they thought it was a good idea to bring these kinds of bosses back is something I will never be able to figure out. As for reason number 2, you really should have the ability to rip these bosses a new one if you have your whole squad with you. That is the whole point of playing with your friends. You don't see the guys over at HAL Laboratories balancing the bosses around the multiplayer aspect in Kirby's Return to Dreamland, and you certainly don't see any of that nonsense happening in the latest Ninja Turtles game either. It is called strength in numbers. A boss going down quickly due to teamwork is always going to be far more efficient than taking things down on your own, and removing that aspect from these fights just so these bosses can get a turn takes away the whole point of having a squad to begin with, while also hurting the single player experience on top of this. I really didn't intend this segment for the bosses to be as long as they were, but I need you to understand that this is by far the lowest point in the game, and considering the fact that you need to deal with these fights at the end of each act is enough to make me never want to touch this game again. Along with these boss fights, the music is another issue I have with the game, which is surprising when you consider the all-star team that is behind the game's soundtrack. Superstar's music is composed by Jun Sano at the helm, with contributors like T-Loops, Takahiro Kai, Rentaro Soma, and several more. Like I said, it is an all-star team. But as good as all of these sound, all it really did was cause the entire soundtrack to lack any real harmony with each other, and instead will put you through a musical whiplash with how often these styles change. Now, there are some cases where it can work. Speed Jungle, for example, goes for this upbeat, cheerful tune that feels as if you're going through a jungle joyride. But the moment Act 2 plays, it immediately sounds like something that belongs in Shadow's levels. And it's here I realized that none of the second acts in these zones will play remixes, which is something that was done in the previous entries. I am not against this, as I felt that it was a unique taste on handling the music, but it does lead to some moments where the music ends up becoming a mismatch. Some of the songs that play also suffers from having a short loop, like the first act in the Egg Fortress. After hearing that song loop for roughly a minute, that's when I turned down the music volume and played something else in the background until the act was finished. But if I had to say who had the weakest tracks out of all of the songs I've heard, it would have to be Jun Sano. I'm not going to point the blame entirely on him, and I know for a fact that he's a very talented musician, but the decision to include tracks that sound like they came straight out of Sonic 4 was not a good look. Not only these tracks are underwhelming compared to the others, they also have a very short loop which gets repetitive after a while. And this is really evident during the boss encounters, which further adds to the dreadful experience those fights have already. See, Having good music in Sonic games is an absolute requirement for the entire experience, even if the game itself is mid at best, because if the music slaps, players are willing to be a little more lenient towards the negative aspects of the game if they are at least provided with a tune that they can jam to. Sure, I find the special stages to be on a more tedious side of things, but since I'm provided with a good track there, I have no problems tolerating these stages. On the other side of the coin, you have the boss fights where they're not only the worst part of superstars, but they're also accompanied with mediocre music that does nothing to mitigate how dreadful these boss fights are. Sure, this is just one example, but my whole point is these weaker aspects in the game wouldn't be as horribly received if the music was better. I'm well aware there's only so much a good soundtrack can do on its own. I would know I've beaten Sonic 3D Blast, but anything that can soften a blow is far better than having nothing at all. I can guarantee you that we wouldn't have a whole team trying to make a better version of Sonic 06 if the music for the overall game was terrible. With all that being said, I can't help but feel like Jun Senoue was underutilized here. If I told you this is the same guy who did the soundtrack for Sonic Heroes, you most likely wouldn't believe me. Finally, let's talk about that multiplayer aspect. I'm just gonna cut right to the chase. Don't do it. While I can see the potential in having multiplayer in a Sonic game, it 100% should have been an online function, or in the case of the Switch, allow players to be able to play on separate screens rather than keeping it local and sticking to one screen only. All you're really doing in reality is playing a game of how long it will take for the leader to outrun everyone else, meanwhile the rest of your team has to struggle to keep up. The way multiplayer works in Superstars is that the camera will always focus on the player who is further ahead than everyone else, which can result in the camera shifting focus very often when you're playing with 4 people who are capable of moving fast. The moment someone is out of bounds, even by a centimeter, players will then have to rejoin by hitting the jump button. This was fine at first until I realized just how unforgiving the game is when it comes to overstepping these boundaries. Not only that, but the multiplayer aspect feels like an afterthought, seeing as how the levels themselves or the overall engine for the game does not cater to the multiplayer experience at all. If my homies are not busy trying to keep up with the pacing of the stages, we're often struggling not to get lost in the level design while keeping in motion. And that amount of discourse revs up to high gear as soon as you enter Speed Jungle, especially in the second act when not everyone is given a firefly so they can navigate the darkness. In situations like those, it's just better to despawn until the leader for the time being gets through these sections of the game. Additionally, if you happen to have a power up like a shield, your character will lose it the moment you go off screen. And while there are no lives, you can still die during the multiplayer. Everyone has their own separate rank count, and should they take damage with no rings or fall into a bottomless pit, they won't be able to respawn until the other players clear the stage, or if they all end up dying. Not having an online function is a wasted opportunity because players would have the freedom of being able to cover more ground, discover secrets you otherwise wouldn't be able to find on your own without the added help, and you can even turn it into a bit of a competition by racing each other. The only time you really get a sense of co-op in this game is when you're fighting the bosses or completing those special stage challenges, and even that doesn't measure up due to all of the flaws that I pointed out earlier. Look, if online play is too big of an issue and local is the only way to go, then they should have kept it old school and bring back the power of split screens. Now, up until this point, I've been showing off footage for the Switch version, and I'm going to warn you right now, do not get the Switch version. It is the weakest one out of all the ports. On the surface, the Switch port appears to be able to hold its own even when you have 4 players on screen, which is impressive. But the moment the graphics demand a little more power from the system, that is when the game will run like the console is on fire. This is mostly evident anytime a character gains a power-up that gives them an after-image effect, because the Switch port can't handle all of the rendering at once. So if you were to activate your superpowers or even gain something as simple as the speed up shoes, which also provides this after image effect, the performance will drop immensely. And that worries me because the final battle against the Black Dragon requires the use of Supersonic, a form that will constantly produce these after images. And I don't need the Switch's frame rate to drop below 20 during a crucial moment in the game like that. I was going to work my way up to that point and try to see if the performance drops this horribly during that battle, until I realized that this requires me to play through Trip's exclusive story and I am at a point where I am not willing to do that. In case you need to know, it is the game's hard mode. All of the stages are designed with the sole purpose to piss you off in every way possible by filling up the levels with cheap enemy and obstacle placement while throwing a lot of trial and error situations at you. How was I supposed to know there was a pillar of flame at the end of this roller coaster? Oh, and these bosses are now even more annoying to deal with than they already were, since now they require more hits before they can go down, and their attack phases are even longer. If I were you, I wouldn't even attempt this without getting Trip's super form unlocked, otherwise you are going to be in for a seriously awful time. What up? This is Future Elusive speaking. I was going to drop this game at this point and not even bother with getting through the mess that is Trip's story, and it dawned on me that this is the first Sonic game where the player must complete this game twice before they can take on the true final boss, rather than just be in the game with all the Chaos Emeralds. And with all that I've said earlier, you can see why I would be burned out at this point. However, I had a change of heart and managed to beat all of Trip's story, much to my dismay. I had a mission and I needed to see how that fight was going to hold on the Switch version, and I was not going to allow this game to beat me. Ladies and gents, I did this not only for myself, but for all of those who wanted to know. You guys actually kept me going and pushed me to see it to the end, and we're finally here. Now let's witness this wonderful dumpster fire. Yep, that is exactly what I expected. The frame rate still dropped and it's performing horrendously like it did before. Switchport is officially garbage. I really wanted to like this game. I got very excited for it when I saw the trailers and showcased its potential, and I foolishly bought the Switch version on day one when it came out. And while I did enjoy some of the levels along with the controls and the character animations, all of the low points I've brought up was enough to make me put this game down for good after I've beaten it. With all that being said, I don't recommend this game to anyone. Leave it on the shelf and walk away. At best, it is mid with a good number of frustrating moments that will take the wind right out of your sails. But if you insist on getting this game for yourself, I urge you to be patient and wait for the game to go on sale, preferably when it's half off if you can. The game is not worth the full price at all. Anyway, that's all I got. If you like the vid, hit me with that siggity sub, and I hope I get to see y'all in the next one. Peace.